Okay, welcome to my presentation. This is going to be a Walmart store performance analysis where I will be attempting to answer the question, what separates Walmart's best stores from its worst, and can we predict it? I threw my webcam in the corner just because it felt right. Pretty small, shouldn't be blocking anything. If it is, I'll move it. I'm going to look to the left a lot because my presentation's over there and the script's in front of me so I can look at the camera. I might need to pause to cough because I'm getting over a cold. Anyway, let's move into an agenda for the presentation. I'm going to start with a quick overview of the data, then I'm going to talk about the research question a little more. To start the actual analysis, we'll discuss my chain-wide exploratory data analysis and the regression I do within that. And then we're going to move down into a store-level analysis where I gain the most insight. And then we're going to discuss the takeaways I get from that and my answers to the research question. And then some confounding factors and issues I have with the data, and some recommendations to fix them for future analysis. And then that'll be the end of it. So moving into a data overview, the data set contains weekly sales data from February 2010 to October 2012 for 45 Walmart stores across the US. It's not a super big data set. I believe it was just over 6,400 total rows. Not very big at all. It contained economic indicators that were temperature, fuel price, CPI, consumer price index, and unemployment. And it had 4 major holiday flags for retail weeks, Super Bowl, Labor Day, Christmas, and Thanksgiving. You can see the specific dates on the presentation, but I'm not going to read them out. The data was sourced from Kaggle. It's split into 2 datasets, walmart.csv, which has those economic indicators. And then when cleaning, I add year and month just for ease of analysis later on. The second dataset is stores.csv, which contains store type and size. And to that, I add average weekly sales and sales per square foot for analysis. These 2 datasets are eventually later merged in the store analysis Python file, which you can check out in the GitHub. Okay, moving on to some more about the research question, which again was what separates Walmart's best stores from its worst, and can we predict it? This question came out of the chain-wide exploration. The gap between the top-performing and bottom-performing stores was very dramatic, with an 8-to-1 ratio from the number 1 performing store to the bottom-performing store. You can see just on screen, the top 10 stores, only that one store at the bottom barely doesn't crack 1.5 million. And then in the bottom 10 stores, only the top 3 even managed to break through 500,000 average weekly sales. And that gap is huge, and that gap is also the most important thing that I could find in the dataset. So the project pivoted to focus on identifying what structural and operational differences drives that performance gap. So I ended up looking at performance through 2 lenses, total weekly sales and raw dollars. We see average weekly sales there, but raw dollars is the important thing in that metric. And then sales per square foot, which measures efficiency. The goal is to understand what separates the best stores from the worst across both metrics, and whether those differences are predictable from the data available. So moving into the actual analysis, we start with a chain-wide exploratory data analysis, and the very first thing I looked at was overall sales across the 2.5-year window. So this is a line graph showing total weekly sales across all 45 stores from February 2010 to October 2012, which is the entirety of the data set. The colored vertical lines, I know it's a lot of color, they mark each holiday week. Red is for Super Bowl, green for Labor Day, yellow for Thanksgiving, and purple for Christmas. 2 patterns stood out here. Sales are flat for most of the year. They hover around 45 to 50 million chain-wide. The dramatic spikes come from Thanksgiving and Christmas, where sales will jump to 70 to 80 million. Super Bowl and Labor Day, like, they're in there. They're flagged as holidays, but the data actually shows very little impact. If you look at some of the Super Bowl dates, the red, like, sure, it spikes a little bit, but it also spikes a little bit right there too. They don't matter. So the holiday spikes actually end up being year-end spikes, if that's important in terms of marketing, if we want to go for a year-end thing instead of just a Christmas thing. Something to think about. So then I rank the 45 stores by average weekly sales. We saw some of that data earlier when I was reiterating on the research question. but here it is visualized. So these two horizontal bar charts are side by side, obviously. They're showing average weekly sales for the top 10 stores in blue on the left, and then the bottom 10 stores in red on the right. Both charts are sharing the same x-axis scale, so the difference in size is directly comparable, and it really is a huge gap. The top performing store averages over 200 million per week, while the bottom averages 250,000 per week. And there's that 8-to-1 ratio I was talking about earlier. This was the most striking thing in the chain-wide data. There are 5 other graphs you can view on the GitHub. There was actually a lot of exploratory data analysis going on. But these 2 graphs here were very much the most important thing that I could find. And they are also what led me to pivot from chain-wide analysis to investigating individual stores, because at this point I could tell whatever was driving overall sales clearly was not distributed evenly among the 45 stores. But, so, moving into the linear regression, just to be certain, I ran 2 models. Model A was on the economic factors. It tested whether economic conditions could predict weekly sales. The features were temperature, fuel price, CPI, consumer price index, that's what that means, and unemployment. The model produced an R-squared of 0.0101, meaning it explained about 1% of the variation in sales, which is just horrible. The RMSE was over 555,000, which is huge considering the average weekly sales per store is about 1 million. Every coefficient is negative. They're there on the screen. None of them point towards any meaningful direction, and this is the first formal confirmation that economic conditions alone are not going to predict chain-wide store sales, as well as confirmation that this chain-wide analysis was not going to provide any meaningful insight, and I needed to switch to store level. So the second model I ran was using the time-based features year, month, and week. This one performed even worse with an R-squared of 0.0028, which is less than 0.5% of sales variation explained. So time-based features also are very bad at predicting sales. RMSE was very close to Model A, again, just over 555,000. And together, these 2 models very, very heavily reinforced what I found through my graphing in the exploratory analysis, that chain-wide features, whether economic or time-based, cannot predict individual store sales, and moving forward, the analysis would need to move to a store level. So just talking a little bit more about the full pivot to store level, at this point, it was very clear to me that chain-wide economic and time-based features did not predict sales. Oh, I'm pink. But the 8-to-1 gap between the top and bottom stores from earlier in the analysis showed some promise. That gap had to be driven by something specific to the stores themselves. So the project pivoted from looking at the chain as a whole to comparing the top 10 and the bottom 10 stores directly. There we go. So, store type and finding. I had to do a little bit of detective work when looking at store types because they don't tell you what the types mean right out. So the stores.csv dataset labeled each store as type A, B, or C, and as I said, it doesn't define what those types mean. To figure it out, I grouped the stores by type, and I looked at what they had in common, and what they had in common was their square footage. Type A stores averaged around 177,000 square feet. Type B averaged around 101,000 square feet, and Type C clustered very tightly around 40,000. And when I later looked it up, and there are 3 types of Walmarts: the supercenters, the neighborhood stores, and then just the general normal size locations. So it made total sense. Almost every top performing so I then took that knowledge and I cross-referenced it with types from the top and bottom 10 stores, which is what you can see on the screen there. Almost every top performing store was type A, and almost every bottom performing store was type B or C, so size alone here is now explaining a huge portion of the gap between the best and worst performing stores. So I confirmed that store size was the dominant driver of raw sales, but I needed a way to compare the stores fairly regardless of how big they were. Obviously, total sales is going to favor the largest stores. You can fit more people in, you have more check lanes, and you can just fit more products in the building. So it doesn't really give smaller stores a chance to show if they're performing well or not. So I added this new metric, sales per square foot. I calculated it by dividing each store's average weekly sales by its size. And then I saved it back into Soros CSV as a new column. And then when I ranked the stores by this new metric, the story completely flipped. You can see here I plotted every store on a scatter plot with store size on the x-axis and sales per square foot on the y-axis. Each dot is representing one store, color-coded by type. Blue is type A, green is type B, and red is type C. And the chart shows that type A stores are clustering down in the bottom right at lower efficiency, while the smaller type B and C stores on the left reach the highest sales per square foot. Sorry, got to. So looking at the top and bottom three performers, yes, looking at the top and bottom three performers by each type, type B and C stores actually lead the chain in efficiency, with the top performers averaging around or reaching around $15 per square foot, while the largest type A stores topped out around $10 per square foot. So type A stores are generating more total sales because of their size, but they aren't the most efficient. This is valuable because it changes how you might think about store performance. A small type C store doing $500,000 a week looks unimpressive next to a type A doing $2 million. But if it's pulling $15 per square foot, it's actually outperforming the larger store on a per space basis. This insight is important for decisions like where to invest in expansions or where to study what's working. And then from here, I had two complementary lenses to evaluate performance. Total sales for raw output and sales per square foot for efficiency. Yeah, good stuff. So to wrap up the store level analysis, I looked at how holidays affected the top and bottom stores. For each store, I averaged sales during holiday weeks and compared them to non-holiday weeks. All top 10 saw a positive bump, and the bottom 10, they were inconsistent. But with only 10 holiday data points per store, these individual percentages are pretty unstable. The more reliable finding that I found came when I compared holiday rankings to overall rankings, and they were nearly identical, which is a surprise. You would expect holidays to be like an abnormally large performer, and that's what we saw in the graph earlier. So the top stores actually stayed on top nearly in the exact same order during holidays, and the bottom stores also stayed on the bottom nearly in the exact same order. So this is a really big finding. Holidays aren't reshaping performance. A store that's performing badly won't start randomly performing really, really good on a holiday. Just compared to the holiday performance in another store, it's still performing bad. It's just a holiday, so people are spending more money. Holidays don't reshape the performance. They amplify it. The implication from this is that improving non-holiday performance should be the focus, and greater holiday performance will follow from that. We don't need to focus on gigantic moves for holidays specifically. We just need to improve day-to-day sales. So going back into the research question, what separates Walmart's best stores from its worst, and can we predict it? The first half of that question, it has a clear answer, and the biggest factor is size. Top performers are large Type A stores, averaging 177,000 square feet, while bottom performers are B and C, under 100,000 square feet. But best depends on how you measure it. By raw sales, the largest stores win. By sales per square foot, the smaller stores are actually more efficient. So both lenses tell a different story about who's performing well. The second half of the question is harder. Can we predict it from the available data? And the honest answer is no. Variables that do separate the stores are static structural ones like size and type that don't change week to week. The variables that we have should drive performance week to week. The variables we have that should drive performance week to week, temperature, fuel price, consumer price index, and employment, they failed to predict sales in regression with R-squared values under 1%. So while I can describe what makes a store top or bottom tier in the context of this data, I can't reliably predict it without better data. So this data, it's hard to predict because it turned out to have several confounding factors, variables that look independent but are actually redundant information. Consumer price index and unemployment are the first example. They barely change within a single store over the entire 2.5 year time span of the data. But they vary dramatically between stores. So they function more as a regional identifier than an economic one. Type and size are redundant as well. So with a store's type, you can reliably predict its size and vice versa. Fuel price and year also carry the same information since fuel price climbs steadily over time. So it is basically just telling you it's just another yearly identifier. These overlaps help explain why the linear regression model performs so poorly. And then recommendations. Yes, I have some data collection recommendations for the company for future analysis. So based on the limitations and confounding factors I encountered within the data, we can make this data set more useful. Totally, we totally can. So first, we need to replace CPI and unemployment with real store location data, like city, state, or region, or all of the above. Those variables are already acting as regional identifiers, CPI and unemployment. They're already acting as regional identifiers, so collecting the location directly would turn them into useful information that allows supplemental research into the locations. Second, we need to drop or replace the redundant features. Type and size are the same information. I would really recommend dropping type and keeping the more specific size, or renaming type into something more descriptive of the location, like what I found online: supercenter, discount store, or neighborhood market for instead of A, B, and C, which would give more context, a lot more context. Fuel price and year are also redundant. I added year myself. But it's unfortunate that the fuel price is kind of just a yearly identifier. I would drop fuel price altogether, or I would find another metric to track transportation accessibility, such as public transport availability or parking capacity, or even just track local gas prices based on the region data for each individual store. That would totally work. It'd be very topical today too. Once redundancy is gone, I would recommend collecting variables that drive store level performance differences. Operational data such as staffing levels, marketing budget, product mix, department sales data would explain a ton of the variation. It would explain all of the variation. Department sales in particular would let you see what's actually selling at each store. And allow direct comparison of stores of similar size. Customer data like foot traffic, demographics, and local competition would also provide some great insight into what's going on with individual stores. And finally, the time frame is just too short. We need to collect these things over a bigger time frame. There are a lot, like gas price. It didn't matter. 2.5 years are not enough to see real long-term trends, especially in the context of retail. And especially when one of those years was partial. We only had half of the third year. But yeah, that wraps up the analysis. Thank you for taking the time to follow along. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me at the email on the screen, because I really don't know when my school email is getting deleted. The full code, any visualizations I didn't include, and the script for this presentation are available in the GitHub repository linked there. I really appreciate the opportunity to share this work. I really enjoyed my time in your classes and in this program. I think I'm super ready for a job, and thanks so much. It's been an honor. Peace.